Orient Seas, also known as the Philippines. It is an archipelago with approximately 7,640 islands and home to more than 110 million Filipinos. Rich in culture, agriculture, and hospitality, this country on the outside seems like a beautiful tropical paradise. But not everything is as it seems. With disputes, poverty, corruption, this is just at the tip of the iceberg. As human rights continue to be violated and neglected, we turn a blind eye to one of our country's very foundation of our melting pot of culture, the ethnic groups that reside in the country. Around 160 ethnic groups continue to be society's most underprivileged and oppressed minority. You might even say that there is a law to protect them. But can we really say they are protected? Let's find out. Indigenous people, or IPs, mostly forgotten by the government, have long been in peril. Land grabs for modernization, agriculture, preservation, and tourism have disproportionately affected them. Similar to how native land is commercialized and moved from natives to businesses, social inequality, and instability, their natural resources are depleting, and their traditional modes of production and consumption are affected as well. Many of them endured and suffered as internally displaced persons or IDPs. Commercialism and modernization often cost local culture and heritage, and thus their identity. Each indigenous group is unique, but these tribes all battle for self-determination and ancestral property. The Indigenous Peoples Rights Act of 1997, or the IPRA, works to improve Indigenous people's situation in conformity with the 1987 Constitution. The IPRA Law acknowledges their legal and legitimate claim to ancestral lands and prohibits others from doing so without prior agreement from Indigenous organization. However, the IPRA must be implemented appropriately. Finally, addressing Indigenous people's issues requires persistent addressing of deep-seated prejudice against them. Some problems go neglected, and most Indigenous people's rights continue to be violated. Moreover, Indigenous rights law doesn't always ensure the legal stability and certainty of Indigenous groups' property ownership.
IPs suffer various issues and have their human rights constantly violated. They are deprived of control for their development based on their views, interests, and goals. They are being politically underrepresented, and they receive a lack of access to social and other services. In the Philippines, IPs have long suffered discrimination under political and economical operations. Rejection and destruction of the IPs' ancestral homelands, relocation, constraints upon and loss of local traditions and practices, and loss of cultural identities all seem to be prevalent. Indigenous people are more likely to be physically harmed when they fight for their lands. The IPs continue to be the country's most disadvantaged and excluded minority. They continuously dedicating themselves to preserving their ancestral lands and origins to the succeeding generations, as they provide a solid foundation for their existence in cultural aspects, social structure, and legal systems. It is a critical problem in the Philippine society since the IPRA is not being effectively implemented and thus not being successful in its promise to protect our indigenous tribes. As a result, an increased rate of poverty, illiteracy, and poor health have emerged. If the IP's ancestral lands are taken away from them, IPs will lose their identity as exceptional individuals. As such, the IPs face a means of survival as the last direct descendants of their ancestors, with the possibility of their ties being severed for good.
We recognize that the IPRA was well-meaning in its mission to protect our country's IPs. Ultimately, we also realize that the IPRA law has become the means of dispossession to exploit indigenous communities for their FPIC or their informed consent. The implementation of IPRA is ineffective because it has been negatively affected by external influences which have controlled the FPIC among other law provisions. The IPRA also contradicts other laws and sometimes using force as a means to relocate our IPs from their domains. So what is a mentioned FPIC? Also, the FPIC is needed for displacement decisions, exploration, utilization of resources, and development, and policies affecting indigenous people in the Philippines. So in theory, the IPRA gives IPs the rights to have a final say in which projects to stop or suspend if they feel it is best for their interests. But in actuality, the FCIP has become, and I quote, a commodity, a result of coercion, manipulation, violence within the communities. FPIC has become yes with a lot of conditionalities, with no not being an option, as per the IP informants. The informant also said that it divides the community because it reinforces a power structure amongst the community. This means that the critical challenge is meaningful representation. An example is when representatives of the community of hunter-gatherers are appointed by project proponents, the representatives tend to lack real authority or real power because in this context, the FPIC procedure completely ignores their ways and fundamentally becomes ineffective as hunter-gatherers do not recognize formal leadership within their group. Also, a key factor preventing the effective implementation of IPRA is the mining industry, which is admittedly very powerful and can easily influence IPs through oppressive means. President Duterte has also favored mining interests, as evidenced by ousting the late Gina Lopez, who revoked licenses to mine IP lands, which has now been reversed by the present administration. With all of that said, the sad truth is that the law by itself is not enough to safeguard IP lands and rights. Our IPs have been discriminated against and looked down upon by lowland people, lowland communities. They have been gravely affected by various displacements, which are usually by those in power who control their respective local governments. A progressive administration is needed to instill authority in supporting our IPs, and maybe then IPRA will become an essential framework that preserves and advances IP rights and interests in the country.
The prevalent issue in this case is the need for sustainable development in the country. For our IPs, their ancestral domain serves as the locus of their identity and way of life. When specific projects displace them or exploit their natural resources, we are disrupting the traditions and structures within our IP communities. This calls for utmost consideration of immediate and long-term benefits for us, our country, and our planet. Sustainable development must be anchored on three pillars: the environment, economy, and society. The ancestral land of the IPs persists in its critical role for food security, livelihood, traditions, and the spiritual identity of the IPs. To preserve biodiversity, IP knowledge may be combined with innovations and information in agriculture, health, nature conservation, and management of the land. This could help to promote the long-term sustainability of IP food, services, and support traditional medicine. However, this technique requires constant attention and urgent, consistent action to generate results.
Ancestral land is fundamental to indigenous identity and culture. And now we ask this: what happens when they are unprotected? What is gained by destroying the native land? Nothing. A financial gain is possible, which is why the privileged support such projects. Displacement reshapes the indigenous institutions and traditions. This includes destroying the sacred and cultural sites, as well as the beliefs that date back to the pre-colonial period. To summarize, IPRA is considered one of the most progressive indigenous rights laws worldwide, according to Molintes in the year 2016. According to the law, the lands, the forests, and the riches beneath them belong to the indigenous community. External solid interests in the past have abused the aspect of the legislation, such as the FPIC, along with the conflicts and challenges with the other laws, and simply used to force to control and take the IPs from their native territories. We acknowledge that the IPRA's objective to preserve and protect the IP's rights was well-intentioned. However, we must recognize that far from being a viable tool for protecting IP rights, the IPRA and its principles have become, in many instances, a system of accumulation by dispossession and a new method to divide or bribe the communities for their FPIC. We stand to argue that the IPRA has yet to be successful. It is ineffectual because it has been unlawfully seized by the powerful external interests who have taken advantage of legal measures such as FPIC aforementioned. There are also inconsistencies between the IPRA and other laws, and abusive force is used to put out the IP's rights in many ways.
As Filipinos in the contemporary world,
We should ultimately consider
Ideal development as fostering an environment
in which people may live healthy and prosperous lives.
we need to look in the other direction of this long-held notion. We must turn inside our own communities for answers.
We must help preserve our communities, particularly our indigenous populations, who are often neglected and powerless.
We must rise up and take action to support our indigenous tribes since they are an integral part of our culture and identity as Filipinos.
And there we say,
And dare we say,
And dare we say,
And dare we say, we must revisit and assess the applicability of the IPRA to further protect IPs from enduring the abuse and other challenges despite the existing potential of the powerful law.
Una, yeah, una, yeah.